ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View this Thanksgiving week. Going to spend just a little bit of time in just a minute talking with Dr. Wendy Patrick, who's been on the program with us before. Then we'll have William Federer, Bill Federer, talk about Thanksgiving and especially his new book that kind of gives us an understanding of what life was like for the separatists, who later came to be known as the Pilgrims, before they came to this world. And so we'll get into that. Next hour, we will certainly focus on some issues in the news. Got some commentaries by Michael Barone, Alan West, John Stossel, to mention just a few. And, of course, we also want to mention real quickly, which we'll get into next hour, the issue of the peace deal, the potential peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Apparently, there is a general agreement to this peace deal, and the Ukrainian President Zelensky will travel to Washington, D.C. by the end of November to finalize the agreement. There's still a number of details to be worked out, and there are lots of questions about whether or not this makes sense for Ukrainian people, but nevertheless, that is a topic we will certainly get to in the next hour and cover it throughout the week here as well. But let me get to our guest, and that is, the other day, you might remember, we had, of course, David Geisler on the program, good friend. Of course, I've known his father for years, co-authored a book with Norm Geisler, and he mentioned that we should connect up with Wendy Patrick. And I said, well, actually, we have. About 2 years ago, we had her on to talk about the book, Why Bad Looks Good. I was so impressed with the book, I even did a commentary on discernment, which is kind of one of our themes. But again, Dr. Wendy Patrick is an individual that has a law degree from California Western School of Law, Master of Divinity from Bethel Seminary, and PhD from the University of Wales. She also has her own radio program, Today with Dr. Wendy, and also is a professor of theology, law, and culture at the Veritas International University, which we've talked about before, teaching courses on everything from Christian ethics, the gospel and culture, interpersonal communications, apologetics, and the art of persuasion. So, Wendy Patrick, welcome back to Point of View.
Oh, Kerby, thanks for having me.
You are a high achiever. We said that last time, but it's always fun to talk about this as well. And for just a minute, let me at least hold up your book. We, of course, promoted it before, but it's worth promoting again. Matter of fact, it'd be a great purchase for maybe even if you're thinking about a Christmas gift, because it's entitled Why Bad Looks Good, Biblical Wisdom to Make Smart Choices in Life, Love, and Friendship. And, of course, we also have a link to your website so people can see all of your books and even follow some of the speaking that you do. We also, of course, have Black Swan Verdicts. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Also linked to some of your social media, so if people would like to contact you, have you come and speak, that is the case. But let's talk about this, because you have, as a prosecutor and as an individual that works in the field of law, but also in the area now of apologetics, need to give us ability to discern what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false. And it does seem to me that that's a very significant part of what you're doing these days.
Oh, isn't that the truth, Kerby? I mean, and thank you for bringing this up. This is one of those sort of bipartisan, equal opportunist, really techniques that anybody wants to be good at. You know, when I pick a jury, I always ask the panel, how many of you think you're really good at discerning whether somebody's dangerous or good or truthful? And you would not believe everybody's hand is waving in the air. But then when you really try to break it down about who's really good at perceiving and discerning, nobody can really give you a good answer. The best that many can do is, sometimes I just feel unsettled, or I just got such a warm feeling from her, Or the famous axe murderer next door statement, he seems like such a nice guy. So you really don't get any facts and circumstances that mean anything unless you know the word. And that's really what drove me to write this most recent book. And you are correct. I'd written a book on reading people, the revision of the New York Times bestseller. I wrote a book called Red Flags, which has a lot to do with what I do as living threat assessment work. And then this Why Bad Looks Good is from a Christian perspective. The deception of public perception is the first chapter, because that encapsulates what you just said, is we all want to be better. We all think we do it every day, but we're really not that good at it unless we know the word.
By the way, I might just mention that previous book, Reading People, How to Understand People, Predict Their Behavior, Anytime, Any Place. But since we're talking about discernment for just a minute, certainly one of the verses you have there, and I would encourage people to maybe take some notes, Proverbs 2, verse 11, discretion will protect you and understanding will guard you. And a little bit later, of course, you talk about in Jeremiah, a very famous verse, call to me and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. It brings us back to the fact that we certainly can have an intuition. You women are very good at this intuition idea, but if you are certainly able to understand God's word, sometimes you can figure out true from false, truth versus error, simply because it doesn't line up with God's word.
That's so true. And, you know, all of the chapters are based on that principle alone. And I love the verse you cited. I actually use it in the introduction under a section called Developing Discernment. And when you talk about that, you can probably off the top of your head think about people that have impressed you just based on their resume, their looks, their the charisma and the chemistry that some people are able to form. And then, they tell you anything they want to say. You're absolutely beguiled by them, only to find out later it was all a fraud. Mm-hmm. But there was nothing about the way they made you feel that would have led to that. In fact, and I, learned a lot about this prosecuting human traffickers, many times you have people that are lured by the undercurrent, by the dark side of society, based not on what you think about them, but based on the way they make you feel about yourself. Valuable, desirable, smart, worthwhile, sometimes the kind of things that somebody has never experienced before. Maybe they grew up in a family where they aren't loved or valued or respected. And you get these bad actors that are able to swoop in and deliver what somebody has been missing all of their life, not knowing you get all those things from a relationship with Jesus. And that is one of the primary drivers of writing this book. I always tell my friends who say, why in the world mid-career as a prosecutor would you, decide to go to seminary? And God called me to do it. So what are you going to say when God tells you to do something? Here I am, send me. And send me he did. I went at night for, 3 years, got the degree, but also really took back to the secular world my desire to showcase how you can be more discerning simply by knowing the Bible.
And again, let me just recommend some of her books, which we've already mentioned. But again, Red Flags, How to Spot Frenemies and Underminers and Toxic People. Of course, we mentioned Reading People. Some of those books that you would find in any bookstore. But this one in particular, Why Bad Looks Good, Biblical Wisdom to Make Smart Choices in Life, Love, and Friendship. 26 chapters, as well as some other introductory material. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that and just the principle of discernment. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know more about her, you can go to wendypatrickphd.com. Of course, we have that link on the website. We have a link to her social media posts. And we also, of course, have information about the book because you can get it in paperback or Kindle. And again, you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but it's been out for a few years now, so we make it easy for you to order it as well. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Wendy Patrick right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Several commentators have said that the conflict between Republicans and Democrats is merely a distraction. The real divide is between the elites and the rest of America. Yesterday, I talked about the economic divide in America, but there's also a political divide. Mary Eberstadt reminds us in a recent column about the last book written by Christopher Lasch and his daughter. The revolt of the elites and the betrayal of democracy may not have made much of an impact then, but Mary Eberstadt argues that it was one book that explained the seismic political shifts to come. His book, she proclaims, now reads as a template of our political reality. Think of the candidate Barack Obama dismissing working-class voters because they get bitter, they cling to their guns or religion. Or think of the candidate Hillary Clinton, who declared that half of Trump supporters fit into a basket of deplorables. 30 years ago, Christopher Lasch wrote that the new elites are in revolt against middle America, as they imagine it, a nation technologically backward, politically reactionary, repressive in its sexual morality, middlebrow in its taste, smug and complacent, dull and dowdy. He also noted that there was also a divide in Europe that was deep and widening. The book was written 30 years ago and was prophetic. There was always a privileged class, but he saw a future widening cultural gap between Washington and America heartland. Today we live in a world where most of the political elite, the economic elite, and the media elite live in a different world and have less respect for other Americans outside their circle. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Dr. Wendy Patrick. Why Bad Looks Good is one of many books, but certainly we'll get into some other issues in just a minute. But one of the things, Wendy, I thought we might focus on, because I took that from the interview we did 2 years ago, is you have a section here talking about following the crowd right off the cliff. And it does seem to me that one of the things we're going to have to understand is discernment sometimes is difficult. Right now I'm teaching through the book of Mark, and I'm in that section of Mark 6, 7, 8, and 9, where it just seems like every time Jesus turns around, there's a controversy. And of course, if you go through the book of Acts, seems like wherever Paul went, first there was a revival, then there was a riot. So there is a sense in which if we are going to exercise discernment, if we are going to apply biblical principles, oftentimes we have to do so recognizing that we're having to be countercultural because the crowd will just pull you right off the cliff, and we need to actually stand up for biblical principles in the midst of a culture that's going the wrong direction.
You know, that is so true. And I have to say, because you mentioned I had a radio show, one of the guests I had, sadly, about a couple months before his untimely death was Charlie Kirk. And I asked him the question you just asked me, to talk about, how do you, sort of deal with that going to college campuses where you're walking into the lion's den and that there are people that are following each other off a cliff. And I asked him to describe wokeism in connection with that question. And here was his answer, quote, "A person or a movement that complains until they control." And that was true whether they're an institution, an organization, a company. And when you talk about following each other off a cliff, that's what we see in social media, people living in silos and consuming news from Facebook and really sort of limiting the stream of information that they receive, none of it, by the way, coming from the Bible. And I know that you probably talk about that as well. I know you're a visiting professor at several different seminaries and no doubt are really looking and listening to some of these young people coming up the ranks that are being exposed to some of these narratives. So, it's a question that's near and dear to my heart. And you're right, I focus right back on, the wise counsel that we can receive if we surround ourselves with good, biblical, godly people. When I was growing up, my parents said, "Show me your friends and I'll show you your future."
Yes.
And that's still, not only is it biblical, but it still remains true today.
Well, let me, if I can, for just a minute, change the topic a little bit to, I'm sure, some things you've talked about on your radio program in the past, because you also talk about learn to read red flags in relationships and maybe some ideas about dating and all of that, because I want our listeners to recognize that these principles don't just apply to evaluate deep philosophical issues. They can really prevent you from falling into a trap, and you have spent so many years years trying to discern what is right and what is wrong as you've been prosecuting individuals, but you've taken those same principles, and maybe we can help some young people out here avoid some of these very difficult circumstances they put themselves in because they can't read some of those obvious red flags that surface even in the dating experience.
Oh, Kerby, what a great question. And you're right. In my most recent book, I have a chapter, When Lust Looks Like Love. But let me give you a really straight answer to that question. Young people are better than they think about reading red flags and potential dating partners. And you're right. The back cover of Red Flags talks about what does your date pay attention to, your body, your brain, or the ball game. I love that. Because what you're doing is you're reading somebody else's attention. Think about it this way. Young people, as well as people our age, they respond to how somebody makes them feel, whether they really understand what they're responding to or not. On a first date, if you feel unsettled, if you are feeling nervous or anxious, that is your God-given intuition telling you something. You may not be able to put your finger on exactly what it is that's making you uncomfortable, but rest assured that is a red flag coming from somewhere. Now contrast that, and I see young people out all the time on dates. Some of them just look comfortable and they're smiling and they're relaxed and they're touching each other on the hand. They just look like they are building healthy chemistry. I'm the eternal optimist here. But the very first time you meet somebody, you are in the best position because you're objective back then. You haven't traded in your reading glasses for rose-colored glasses yet. So you're in a really good position to perceive everything you need to. So be aware, be well-nourished. Don't be hungry or angry or anything else that's going to interfere with your ability to get a really good read on somebody else the first time you meet them. From there, it's much easier.
Again, just great wisdom in some of those books, but I thought I'd be remiss if, especially since it's Thanksgiving week, and Wendy, also this year we're focusing on the 250th anniversary of this country since the Declaration of Independence, which will, of course, take place next year. And I know recently you've been speaking on patriotism, a love of one's country, and we, of course, even have provided for many of our first-time donors what's called a Patriot Pack. It's got my book on One Nation Under God, one on the Bill of Rights. It has one, for example, in the Federalist Papers, has one about the patriot pastors and things of that nature. There is such a need, and I know you feel that as well, for us to really rekindle some of that patriotism, because I do remember back in 1976, the 200th anniversary, the bicentennial of this country, lots of patriotism. This 250th anniversary, not so much. And it does seem to me we have some work to do, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And, Kerby, it's just been, I would say, within maybe the last 5 to 7 years, that's really been driven home that, people worry about wearing an American flag. They worry about displaying one. They worry about offending people by being a patriot. I mean, we are so lucky, when we hear about our brothers and sisters in Nigeria and other places around the world where Christians are being persecuted, and we just go out and enjoy the ability to worship every Sunday during the week, explore our faith-based connections to other people, go out and do evangelism without thinking for a minute, wait a minute, this is tied to the fact that we live in the greatest country in the world, and we have that freedom to go out and do that. So, I think I define myself in my radio show as prosecutor, patriot, and Jesus follower, because it is absolutely true. And I am just hoping that pendulum is going to swing, and I know that you do too, and I see the guests that you have on your show. And I have to say, I'm absolutely delighted to be the warm-up act for Bill Federer. He was the speaker at my church 2 days ago. So I just saw him talk about the history of Thanksgiving. So you're in for a treat. But yes, big patriotism fan, and I only hope, especially with the revival that Charlie Kirk's sacrificial death almost has inspired among both Christians and non-Christians, that I hope we're getting back to that patriot level of respect and love for country.
As a matter of fact, our December issue of the Outlook magazine is on revival. I do the one on the history of revivals, and one of our speakers talks about the Charlie Kirk effect, and then we have John Stonestreet of the Colson Center talking about, is this revival? So in some respects, that is another topic as well that we certainly could address. But just before we go, let me just encourage people to go to your website. It's wendypatrickphd.com. Don't have to remember all that because we have the link there. But there is an opportunity for people to have you come and speak and to maybe address various corporate events. Certainly because of your legal background, this would be a great outreach there. And even just maybe even to give your testimony and share some of the things that come from your books on reading people and red flags and even why bad looks good. These are all resources. So again, those resources are available at your website. And again, if people would want to contact you, all they need to do is click on that button, don't they?
That's all they need to do, and I would be delighted to come and speak. It's really something that's a ministry of passion, and hopefully something that we can arrange. So thank you so much for providing all that great information.
Well, now thank you for doing an interview apparently with David Geisler, and he mentioned Wendy Patrick. And so, believe me, I know that name, and we followed you in the past, and I'm glad that you had a little bit of time during this Thanksgiving week to spend some time with us. And if nothing else, you've been a great warm-up back for William Federer. We'll be on in just a minute.
Right.
So thanks for being with us today.
I follow you as well. Thank you so much.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, Bill Federer, good friend, been on the ministry many times. We're going to talk about the history of Thanksgiving. And, of course, we'll also mention his book as well, The Treacherous World of the 16th Century. So we'll give you a little of the background. Before they came to be known as pilgrims, there were those who were oftentimes the separatist, and those were those who wanted to separate from the Church of England. At the same time, you had those who were Puritans who wanted to purify the Church in England. But he gives us a real look at what it was like and why they decided to first leave England, go to the Netherlands, Leiden in the Netherlands, and then eventually come to settle in the Plymouth colony. So I think you'll enjoy that conversation. The other day when I had Jerry Newcomb, I dressed as a pilgrim. I was tempted to do that again, but I think we've done that once. But we will certainly spend some time talking about the history of Thanksgiving, why you can take some of those principles and apply them and even share them with your children and grandchildren this time next week. We'll be right back.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to be talking now with William Federer. Of course, you knew he was coming. If last week we were talking with Jerry Newcomb, at one point he mentioned Bill Federer, and I said, well, we're going to have him on next week. And then just a few minutes ago, we were doing an interview with Dr. Wendy Patrick, and she said, oh, he was just at my church. So he's had a pretty good introduction. And if you're not familiar with Bill Federer, of course, he is a best-selling author, probably best known for his encyclopedia, America's God and Country encyclopedia of quotations. But we're also going to talk about this relatively new book, The Treacherous World of the 16th Century and How the Pilgrims Escaped It, which is in a sense a prequel to America's Freedom. An individual that grew up in St. Louis, an individual that has spoken on all sorts of different topics. And if you turn on radio, you will hear him on a variety of different programs. And Bill Federer, always great to have you on the program.
Kerby, great to be with you.
And again, your reputation precedes you. Everybody from Jerry Newcomb to Wendy Patrick have been talking about you, so that is good. Let's, for just a minute before we get into, of course, the treacherous world of the whole 16th century, I do encourage people to get some of your books. We have AmericanMinute.com, and you have all of your various resources. Of course, you have your American Minute, which is available as well, and so if people want to get media, whether it's TV or radio, whether they would like to maybe encourage you to come and speak for their group, and I know you do a great deal of that, or if they just like to buy some of your books, it's all available on our website, AmericaMinute.com. And again, you have certainly been able to educate a lot of people around the country through your radio program and even through your television program, haven't you?
Well, it's been amazing, and of course, I think you were there at the very beginning of my career when my first book came off the press, and I just so appreciate you and Point of View Radio Talk Show and the great work you're doing, and happy Thanksgiving to all the listeners.
Well, if we can, again, mention that encyclopedia is one I would highly recommend, but this new one is kind of fun because we oftentimes pick up the story with the Pilgrims, at first known as the Separatists and others, when they are thinking about leaving Leiden and coming to this new world. But here you remind us of the world that they were in and how difficult it was if you were a Puritan, a separatist, and you wanted to separate from the Church of England, but you would be persecuted, or if you were a Puritan and you wanted to purify, whether you're separating or whether you're purifying, there was a lot of contentious issues, and that's one of the reasons why this issue of religious liberty was so important for the Pilgrims, isn't it?
Yeah, so I start off painting a big picture of what was going on in the world at the time the Pilgrims were alive. The Chinese emperors, the Indian Maharajas, the Shahs in Iran, the Muslim sultans, and how Islam conquered all of North Africa, which used to be Christian. They conquered Syria, which used to be Christian. They conquered Spain, held it for 700 years. And they conquered Turkey, which used to be Christian. And then they conquered Constantinople, cutting off the land routes to India. That's when Columbus set sail, looking for the New World. And so the Spanish had a monopoly on the New World. And they're taking gold from Portobello, Panama, all the way to Cuba, and then back to Spain. And they have pirates, French pirates, English pirates, Sir Francis Drake, and Dutch pirates. And so the setting in Europe is the King of Spain captures the King of France. Francis I is his name. And after a couple concessions, lets him go. Well, the King of France goes and makes a treaty with the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent against Spain. And so now Spain can no longer defend its North African cities, and it cannot defend Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And meanwhile, you have one in Europe prior to the Reformation, it's a Catholic. And then when the Reformation happens, it's one denomination per country. So Northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran. Switzerland, Calvinist, Scotland, Presbyterian, England, Anglican, Holland, Dutch Reformed. And if you didn't believe the way your king did, you were persecuted, and it was serious. So the King of Spain controlled the Netherlands, and in 1572, after stopping the Muslims on the Mediterranean with the Battle of Lepanto, he sends the Iron Duke of Alva, who kills 10,000 Dutch Reformed in the Spanish Fury.
Amazing.
And then the Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici, she kills 30,000 of the Protestant Huguenots in the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. That was a bad year, 1572. Anyway, a bunch of French Protestants tried to settle America in 1565 in and around Fort Caroline, which is today Jacksonville, Florida. The Spanish found out about it and butchered 300 of the men, took the women and children away. And so this is sort of the setting. That's the treacherous world that's going on. You have the King of Spain has a daughter, Catherine of Aragon, and she's married to Henry VIII. And after 18 years, she does not have a son. Henry wants a son, so he decides to divorce her. The Pope won't recognize the divorce, so Henry makes himself his own Pope. goes on to have 6 wives. And he had William Tyndale burnt at the stake, but William Tyndale's last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And so now the King of England actually wants an English Bible, thinking that it'll help him split from Rome, the same way the Germans have a Lutheran Bible that Martin Luther had, helped them to split away. Some people read the Bible and wanted to purify the Church of England, so they're nicknamed Puritans, and the king doesn't like him. Another group said it's beyond hope of purifying. We're going to separate ourselves.
Right.
And again, they call themselves Baptists. We call them Pilgrims. And so these separatists were outlawed. And the government wrote all the possible prayers they could think of in a book called the Book of Common Prayer. And if you feel like praying, you just open it to the right page and read the prayer. You don't make up your own prayers, because you could make up one that's wrong. And so if you're having a little small group meeting and making up your own prayers, the police will kick in the door and arrest you and drag you to the star chamber. It's a room with stars on the ceiling, and they would twist your arm and brand you on the face as a heretic and cut off your ear, and then stick you in the Newgate prison where nobody fed you. You had to have some friend that missed you. And so you had the one Baptist founder, John Merton, starves to death, and another one, Thomas Helwise dies, and then another one, John Smith, has a church, and branching off of John Smith's church is John Robinson's church, and he is the Pilgrims' pastor.
Right.
And so you get a little setting of, whoa, that's what the Pilgrims were fleeing when they came to America.
Well, again, they decided first to go to what we would call the Netherlands or Leiden, but after, I guess, about 10 years, they said, well, we've escaped some of this religious persecution, but we can't seem to escape the worldliness of that, and so made a really fateful decision to go to the New World under a charter. Isn't that correct?
Right. So they were in Leiden, Holland, and Spain threatened to attack again. Plus, as you mentioned, they're there a dozen years, and the kids are like growing up to be Dutch kids, and the Pilgrims realized we're going to be a one-generation movement. They originally think of going to Guyana, South America, because they heard of the Perpetual Spring. Then somebody reminded them of what the Spanish did to the French Protestants in Fort Caroline, Florida. So they said, well, let's go to Jamestown. Now, they were going to submit to the king's government in Jamestown, but they get blown off course in a storm. It's a good thing they didn't make it there, because between 1607 and 1624, 4,000 died. One winter, they start off with 500 in Jamestown. By the end of the winter, there's only 50. I mean, and then they had an Indian attack in 1622 that killed a quarter of Virginia. So if the Pilgrims would have landed there, they'd have suffered that fate. Well, they get blown off course and land on the shores of Massachusetts, try sailing south, but they get caught in some sand bars called shoals and breakers and almost sink in a storm. So they go back to Plymouth Rock, and the captain says, off the boat. And they go, we have a question. Who's going to be in charge? Well, we were going to go to Virginia and submit to the king's government, and you're telling us to get off? Well, there's 102 of us in the boat, and nobody's been picked by the king. They do something unique. They take their little covenant church group and they turn it into their political civil body politics. It's called the Mayflower Compact. We, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic. It's a polarity change in the flow of power on planet Earth. In the womb of the Mayflowers conceived the child of self-government. Instead of top-down rule by kings and pharaohs, it's ruled bottom-up just by the 102 of us. And so where did they get that idea? From the Reformation, then the Bible, what part of the Bible? The first 400 years out of Egypt before Israel got a king. It's called the Hebrew Republic.
Right. From
1400 BC to 1000 BC, you have millions of Israelites and no king. It's the book of Judges, but it's a total anomaly in world history, millions of people and no king. And it worked because everybody's taught the law, and they're personally accountable to God to follow it. So you have an opportunity to steal, nobody's around, and then you think God's watching. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. Create a tiny thing in your head called the conscience.
Yes.
If everybody believes this, you can maintain order with no king. And so this was studied by the Pilgrims. So it's called the Hebrew Republic, and the Puritans were nicknamed Christian Hebraists.
Right.
And it worked in Israel until the priests went woke and went rainbow church and stopped teaching the law. And Eli, the high priest, his own sons are committing sexual immorality in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. And they all go to Samuel the prophet. They say the self-government system's not working. We want a king. Why is this story important? Kings of Europe look to the Bible, but they look to the King Saul and after.
Yes.
And the Puritans look to the pre-King Saul.
And they look to a different part of the Bible. We're going to come back and talk a little bit about some of the political lessons and even the economic lessons that we can learn from the Pilgrims. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
William Federer with us as we are talking about his book, The Treacherous World of the 16th Century, How the Pilgrims Escaped It, really a prequel to American freedom. And Bill, you've talked certainly about the religious lessons there, that how important our religious liberty is. You did mention, of course, the political lessons that they really established a body politic, or the Mayflower Compact, kind of the first Constitution of America, which is a republic. But one of the other things you talk about in your book, and I thought we might talk about that, is when they came there, they used what I think was a collective economic system in which everybody worked and then were fed out of the common stores. And I think it was William Bradford who saw the failure of what was kind of an experiment on socialism or communism, and then decided to assign plots of land. And in light of all the conversation, Bill, we're having these days about socialism and communism, I think that's another lesson we can learn from the Pilgrims, don't you think?
Yeah, it's often overlooked, but the Pilgrims had no money, so they had to borrow money from investors in England called adventurers, and they wrote up bylaws for the London Company, and it says that everything would be owned in common for 7 years. Everything got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing shall go into ye common stock, and all are to have their meat, drink, and apparel, and all provision out of ye common stock. So you're out there working, and you're working, it goes into this big pile, and then if you need something, it gets taken out of the pile. William Bradford said they tried it and almost starved to death. He says the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato. Why Plato? I wrote a book called Socialism, The Real History from Plato to the Present. Plato's the first one that talked about everybody owning everything in common. And it sounds good until you think it through. Somebody has to be in the government handing out the common stuff, and they're always going to be tempted to give a little extra to their family and friends, and it always turns out into a discretionary thing, and it fails. But it was all theoretical. You know, Sir Thomas More's Island of Utopia, it's theoretical, but the Pilgrims realized they're the first ones actually trying to live out communal living. And he says that the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion. For the young men who were most able and fit for service objected to being forced to spend their time working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes than the weak man who was not able to do a quarter what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes with the younger ones considered it an indignity and disrespect. As for men's wives who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. He goes on, let none think this is due to human failing rather than to this communistic plan of life in itself. I answer, God in his wisdom had another plan. So, after much discussion, it was decided that every family should plant corn for their own household. So every family was assigning parcel of land. This was very successful. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. So they tried communistic plan. It didn't work, so they gave everybody their own plot of land. They worked hard, and they had an abundant harvest for Thanksgiving.
And again, if you think about that, when the children of Israel came into the Promised Land, each one had their own land. So this concept of private property, which I think is rooted in the Bible, it's rooted in our view of human nature, is the first thing that Karl Marx later on throws out. It's also the idea of what those individuals who were part of that communal experiment was throwing out. And I think we're learning some lessons even here in the 21st century, since you might have noticed we have elected at least a few socialist mayors in places like New York City and in Seattle, Washington. And I think we could learn some lessons from the Pilgrims, couldn't we?
Yeah, as long as human nature is sinful and selfish, you're always going to have people wanting to abuse their positions of power. And it's even if a good person was in there, he'd tend to prefer their family and friends over strangers and enemies. But one of the other things I thought interesting with the Pilgrims is they had one of their ships captured by Muslim pirates.
I was going to bring that up, yes. Because we've talked about the Barbary pirates during the time when Thomas Jefferson was president, but that goes all the way back to the 17th century, doesn't it?
Right. So Muhammad fought in 66 battles and raids, and they raided caravans. And so he got verses from his Allah. One of them is that he gets a fifth of the booty. Another verse says that Allah has given you the slave girls as your booty. So they're robbing caravans. Well, once the Muslims get to the Mediterranean, they rob ships. And they rob the coast of Europe. In 846 AD, 11,000 Muslim pirates raided Rome, Italy, and sacked the Basilica of St. Peter's and trashed the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul. And so that's when Pope Leo built a 39-foot wall around the Vatican. But they would capture Europeans and sell them into slavery. And so there were whole Catholic orders in Europe in the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians, and they would collect alms at church services, go under a white flag to North Africa to ransom back your friend, like Miguel de Cervantes at Roman of La Mancha, Don Quixote. He was captured by the Muslim pirates, and he was ransomed back by this order. Anyway, the countries in Europe would pay an annual tribute to the Muslim pirates to leave their country's ships alone. And then, of course, when America became independent of Britain, they demanded we pay our own tribute. And that turned into the Barbary Pirate Wars. But here's the Pilgrims. At 1625, the adventurers, those investors in England that fronted the money for their boat ride, they sent a couple empty ships over and said, fill them up. And so William Bradford writes that they filled the ships with core, fish, and 800 pounds of beaver skins. And they went back to England. And when they were in the English Channel, she was unhappily taken by a Turkish man of war, carried off to Salar and Morocco, where the captain and crew were made slaves. Thus, all their joys and happy message, joyful news they meant to carry home was turned to heavy tidings because of the ship taken by the Turks. All trade was dead.
Wow.
So the Sultan in Morocco, Moulay Ismail, had captured 25,000 Europeans that built him a palace at Mekanez, and he had 500 wives that bore him a record 1,042 children. And so this was that the Pilgrims had to face this.
The Barbary Pirates. Just about out of time, so let me mention a few things. First of all, I would highly recommend, and we have a link there, if you would like to get a copy of The Treacherous World of the 16th Century, How the Pilgrims Escaped It. But I also might mention, since we did talk about socialism, one of your other books a while back, Socialism, The Real History from Plato to the Present, as well as, of course, so many other great books, including, of course, your encyclopedia. So if people would want to contact you, I see you speaking in churches all over the country, they could go to that website and contact you and have you come and speak, can't they?
Yeah, I'd love it. AmericanMinute.com. There's stuff we didn't get to, Squanto and how he was an Indian that was kidnapped and actually in England and learned English, but then dropped off on the shores of America just the winter before the Pilgrims landed. And he walks out of the woods speaking to them in perfect English. You could imagine how shocked the Pilgrims were with that one. And then even Squanto, William Bradford says that they were exploring and they were caught in the freezing rain out in the ocean. And Squanto fell ill of Indian fever. Within a few days, he died. And he said that Squanto begged Governor Bradford to pray for him that he would go to the Englishman's God in heaven.
Great story.
So here he saw the real Christians. He says, I want to go to your God.
Well, again, all sorts of things are in that book. And again, we wanted you to know about that. And of course, wanted you to know about William Federer. You could have him come and speak in your own church. So, Bill, happy Thanksgiving. And thank you for a very short, but I think very meaningful update on some of the history of Thanksgiving. And thank you for being with us today.
Well, Kerby, happy Thanksgiving to you and all the listeners.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some of the issues in the news. And we've already covered quite a bit just in the first hour, but we still have an hour to come. And those of you that can't listen on radio, you might want to go to your computer to get some of the material that we're going to be talking about next hour. But we need to take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
I have a little nutcracker decoration that counts down the days, and it tells me that Thanksgiving and Christmas are coming fast. But so is another special day, Giving Tuesday. December 2nd, people around the world are going to take part in this annual tradition of showing generosity in the middle of a season that's often marked by busyness and consumerism. It is so easy to focus on what we need in our own life, but I encourage you, pray about what you can give this Giving Tuesday and consider partnering with Point of View. By partnering with Point of View this Giving Tuesday, you'll be part of a mission to give truth to America in a time when it's desperately needed. Mark your calendar so you don't forget to give on Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. Or you can give anytime by visiting us online at pointofview.net or calling 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, it is Tuesday, and I thought just might mention real quickly that next Tuesday is Giving Tuesday. That will be December 2nd, and that is the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, and it is something that I think is very appropriate because, as we all know, there's a lot of fun and food and fellowship and maybe even chaos first with Thanksgiving, and I've seen some memes, maybe you've seen them too, just as we set our clocks back for fall back, getting off of daylight savings time. A lot of people saying you should set your scale back about 15 pounds getting ready for Thanksgiving. That's a joke, of course, but nevertheless, we are going to have gone through Thanksgiving, and as a matter of fact, tomorrow we'll have our Thanksgiving quiz if you'd like to use that again around the Thanksgiving table. And whether you use some of the material we talked about today with Bill Federer, or as Ivan suggested next week, it's always hard really to talk about Thanksgiving very much over Thanksgiving. There is the, if you will, the difficulty of trying to communicate with your kids and all the rest, but if you want to do so, that's fine. But some of the material that he covered would be great to share, maybe in a family devotion or something like that, so we do make that available. But next Tuesday is Giving Tuesday, and we really want to encourage you to pray on how you might give. We already have established a goal, and we hope that we can meet that. And it's just one more reminder in our calendar about the fact that you don't have to wait till December 31st to give to Point of View or to even give to other ministries. I would certainly encourage you that if you are listening to this program right now on a radio station that does fundraising, I mean, some radio stations actually have commercials, and so they're a commercial station, but a lot of the stations that carry this program are non-commercial. They may have a share-a-thon or a fundraiser or something of that nature. I would encourage you to think about what you might do to support them on Giving Tuesday as well. I know many of you probably already give on a regular basis to your church, but I hope that you'll consider giving to all sorts of other Christian ministries, including this one. And so Giving Tuesday next Tuesday, those of you that receive an email from me me. We sent that out a while ago, and it's maybe the first of other emails just to remind you of a real opportunity to give next Tuesday. Let's get into some of the issues in the news. I mentioned in the last hour that one of the pieces comes from Michael Barone. He is a senior political analyst. He's been a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, probably best known as being the co-author of the Almanac of American Politics. He has a new book called Mental Maps of the Founders, which I think we might also use later on as we talk about this 250th anniversary of this country. But he also serves as a senior political analyst for the Washington Examiner. And this piece, I think, is helpful because it has the very, if you will, arresting title, Enforcing Immigration Laws is Not the Moral Equivalent of the Holocaust. I hope you understand that. But I think it is an illustration that once you start saying, well, taking individuals off the streets and deporting them back to their home country is comparable to the Holocaust, would you not do all you can to have protected Jews being taken off to the death camps? But there's a real difference, as we'll find out tomorrow in a very good piece that I've already had certainly Steve post for us. It also gets back to the whole claiming that individuals are fascist. There's this great interview, and we'll talk about that tomorrow, about the individual that was actually with Antifa and admitted that we don't call people fascist in a sense so that maybe then we could justify someday killing them. We actually want to kill them, so that's why we call them fascist. So there is a sense in which once you start using labels like this, it is really dangerous. And so Michael Barone asks a good question. Where does this conviction come from, first in America, and in Britain, and in all of Europe, that open borders are the only moral immigration policy? And he gives us a little bit of history, which I think we need to remind ourselves of. He says former presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, like the George Bushes, so that gives you 4 different presidents, professed to want to enforce immigration laws. They decried the flood of illegals that crested in the prosperous decade before the financial crisis, and afterwards saw with relief that the flow of illegals slowed. Well, Michael Barone says, as I wrote recently, careful projections, and I think this is good because his projection of the illegal population estimate, he thinks it may have peaked at about 12 million in 2007, fell to about 10.5 million in 2019, and then increased by at least 4 million during the Biden administration, which essentially, as he said, opened the borders to the point of paying for illegals to live in New York's Roosevelt Hotel, 2 short blocks from where Jamie Dimon's J.P. Morgan Chase was constructing a $3 billion office tower, which I think is an interesting irony there. And he says immigrants to the United States over the past half century have come mostly from Latin America and Asia, from countries that to varying degrees share religious orientations, market economic norms, and cultures of literacy and numeracy with most Americans. It's likely true that floods of mostly illegal immigrants, like those welcomed by the Biden administration, will tend to have a higher proportion of violent migrants than among legal immigrants. And I think that's a true statement, quite frankly. But this is a problem of orders of magnitude greater in Britain and in Europe, where very large shares of immigrants from Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia are Muslims, and they really, as he points out, fail to assimilate with that. A good example, he says, is of the scandal in Britain of the so-called grooming gangs, which often had individuals that had settled, came here from Pakistan and Afghanistan, who were used to sexually abusing and even enslaving adolescent working-class English girls. And for the past 2 decades, this oppression, he says, was largely ignored by Britain's political parties, local national police forces, national press, certainly by the TV set owner subsidized BBC. And so the European elites in government and the press have suppressed news of immigrant violence, even when directed at women and gays, and political parties that campaign for restrictions on immigration oftentimes are treated as pariahs, with their established parties never really even allowing them to be part of the coalition government. And he gives some examples. First of all, the ADF party, anything but for changing German poverty and all property and all that kind of stuff. But he said it's really apparent from these policies that restricting the inflow of these immigrants into some of these countries, which has happened in, say, Poland and Hungary, are actually seen as the moral equivalent of Nazism. And so he writes this piece in large part to just simply say we need to not only pay attention to the fact that people are referring to anybody they dislike as a fascist or Hitler, we're also seeing that once you start this argument that enforcing immigration laws is tantamount to Nazism and the Holocaust, you get the kind of violence we're starting to see in this country, in England, and in Europe. And so I think it's a very good piece, and it's one that I have posted for you to read in its entirety. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Several commentators have said that the conflict between Republicans and Democrats is merely a distraction. The real divide is between the elites and the rest of America. Yesterday, I talked about the economic divide in America, but there's also a political divide. Mary Eberstadt reminds us in a recent column about the last book written by Christopher Lasch and his daughter. The revolt of the elites and the betrayal of democracy may not have made much of an impact then, but Mary Eberstadt argues that it was one book that explained the seismic political shifts to come. His book, she proclaims, now reads as a template of our political reality. Think of the candidate Barack Obama dismissing working-class voters because they get bitter, they cling to their guns or religion. Or think of the candidate Hillary Clinton, who declared that half of Trump supporters fit into a basket of deplorables. 30 years ago, Christopher Lasch wrote that the new elites are in revolt against middle America, as they imagine it, a nation technologically backward, politically reactionary, repressive in its sexual morality, middlebrow in its taste, smug and complacent, dull and dowdy. He also noted that there was also a divide in Europe that was deep and widening. The book was written 30 years ago and was prophetic. There was always a privileged class, but he saw a future widening cultural gap between Washington and America heartland. Today, we live in a world where most of the political elite, the economic elite, and the media elite live in a different world and have less respect for other Americans outside their circle. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
My commentary today is about elites, and yesterday, you might remember, if you were listening to the commentary or had a chance to look at it online, that we talked about the economic divide in America, and I really used this open letter that an economist wrote to Bill Maher about the economy. Well, today I want to take a different tact and look at the divide, if you will, between the elites and the rest of America. And while it's true in this country, it's even more true in other countries. And I just illustrated that a minute ago by pointing out that any particular political party in England, or especially, let's take the one in Germany, the AfD party there, for example, was just almost isolated and referred to as Nazis. And there is a sense in which we have had always a divide between the aristocracy, not truly aristocracy, but the sort of fake aristocracy, because we don't have royalty in this country, and the rest of the population. And there are many commentators that have said many times we get distracted by thinking the real battle is between red and blue, between Republicans and Democrats. And I'm not minimizing that, but the real divide in some respects is between the elites and America. And so this piece today comes from a column written by Mary Eberstadt. It's been a while since we've had her on. Maybe we'll get her on again. But she points out that one of the last books, matter of fact, I think it was the very last book that Christopher Lasch wrote, he actually wrote with his daughter, called The Revolt of the Elites and Betrayal of Democracy. And the point she's making is that book, though it was written 30 years ago, was prophetic. I mean, he was, in a sense, predicting what we see today. And she said it was almost like a template of our political reality. Some examples I use, and she alludes to those as well. Think of candidate Barack Obama, who dismissed working class voters because they get bitter, they cling to their guns or religion. Think of candidate Hillary Clinton, who declared that half of Trump supporters fit into a basket of deplorables. And if I can quote from Christopher Lasch's book, he said, "The new elites are in revolt against middle America as they imagine it, a nation technologically backward, politically reactionary, repressive in its sexual morality, middle brow in its taste, smug and complacent, dull and dowdy." And you can kind of see that he was pointing out that the divide which he was seeing in America was even worse in Europe. And I think that explains a great deal. We've talked about debanking, and in the next couple of days I want to talk about even some Americans, again, who have been debanked. Recently I got the Eric Trump book on Under Siege, and it talks about, of course, how they, as the family, was debanked for all sorts of reasons. And no story goes on, but you originally had some of the people being debanked in England because they supported Brexit, which was the idea of separating England from the European Union. And you have people today that have been debanked because they, for example, had questions about, the vaccine. They maybe were engaged in actually using firearms. As a matter of fact, that whole attempt to begin to debank individuals that were selling firearms, even though we have a Second Amendment, later on cryptocurrency, all the rest. And so there has just always been this sort of elite and then the rest of the population. And we are seeing it time and time again. And of course, the example we just used a minute ago in terms of the attitude towards immigration is rather dramatic, because now today the elite groups have no problem with open borders, in part because they don't have to deal with it. If you live behind a gated community, it probably doesn't affect you. And if it pulls down the wages of working Americans, hardworking Americans or working class Americans, however you want to define them, doesn't affect you, and so you really don't care. And you can see that is, I think, going to be one of those really big issues we're going to be dealing with in politics, hence my commentary today on the elites. Let me get to another article, though, and this one is disturbing, because it's written by an individual who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And he actually says, would you be in favor of having an 8% income tax surge for the rest of your life? And the answer is, of course not. But the argument he is making is the declines in student achievement over the past dozen years work out to have a similar reduction in your income. And the sad reality is that even before the pandemics and the lockdowns hit schools, scores were already dropping, but the declines that took place after the pandemic and lockdown were even more significant. And so he says, if you can take this at face value, and I certainly do, when accounting for the impact of higher achievement historically on salaries, the lifetime earnings of today's average student will be an estimated 8% lower than that of students in 2013. Because long-term economic growth depends on the quality of the nation's labor force, the achievement achievement declines translate into an average of 6% lower gross domestic product for the remainder of the century. And of course, the dollar value of this lower growth is 15 times the total economic cost of the 2008 recession. So the point he's making is, even though we pumped $190 billion of emergency funds into school districts, we don't really see a significant change. He says the problem and these declines are not going to be solved with Band-Aids. He even points out that the spending per student is more than 2.5 times that of what existed in 1970. And with all these reforms, we see that the achievement gaps have either been unchanged or in many cases they've dropped precipitously. So he also points out that today's education system remains more concerned with adult employment than with student achievement. And if you are saying, well, okay, do you have some solutions to that? And he points to two which caught me off guard. One was the District of Columbia, and the other was Dallas, Texas, where we're broadcasting from right now. And apparently they have actually implemented different kinds of programs, and they have actually been able to see some significant effectiveness in the classroom. By the way, I might just mention, he doesn't mention it here, but we've on this program before talked about the Mississippi Miracle. And if you go to the latest John Stossel video, which we'll probably cover in a future program, some of the success and the remarkable turnaround in the schools in Mississippi has to do with one word: phonics. I know some of you might think phonics, really? Well, phonics is based on the idea that once you understand how to decode the letters, then you know how to decode the word, and then you become a very effective reader. And that is certainly something that we will get into in the future. But he's not even talking about the issue of phonics. He's just talking about trying to bring some of the decision-making in the schools back to the lowest level. He says, for example, organizational and teaching decisions are moved closer to the school, and effective schools are given license to continue what they are doing, and then incentives are implemented and are tied to student performance. And so in some respects, he's saying, I see some of this taking place because the United States is already sort of getting into that window because of the proposed, under the Trump administration, reduction in the education department's role in regulating school operations. But again, it's a reminder that if we don't do anything, it's essentially like an 8% lifetime tax coming to our students. We did it to them, and they deserve better. So again, I think it illustrates, again, what's going on in the public schools. It also, I think, illustrates the possibility that we're going to see, once again, an exodus from the public schools into charter schools, into private schools, maybe even to home schools, simply because parents are going to be more and more concerned that their children don't know how to read, they don't understand basic math, and they certainly don't know our history. It does seem to me that we should look at these issues of functional illiteracy as well as cultural illiteracy, not to mention spiritual illiteracy, and provide some viable alternatives. So again, it's a very important article. It appeared in the Washington Post, and it documents, again, what is happening in our public school systems and the need to turn this around. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, it's about time to talk about those elected officials that actually told individuals in the military that they are to resist illegal orders. What about that? Well, Colonel Alan West has a few comments. We'll cover those right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Again, half an hour left, and then we will tomorrow focus on some very important issues in the news and then wind it down. Let me just mention that I do think it's about time for me, before this week is out, to say something about the 6 members of Congress that have put together a video calling for individuals who are in the U.S. Armed Forces to refuse illegal orders. And we'll talk about that. And I've got a very good piece by Colonel Alan West. Also some other things that have been surfaced. Interesting enough, even some comments by Matt Taibbi, who is the former Rolling Stone editor and actually comes at it from a leftist point of view, but I think he brings some common sense to the conversation as well. And then the last segment, I thought we would end on a positive note, and that is our golden age. This is a piece by John Stossel, because after all, we have spent a fair amount of time talking about some of the economic challenges and certainly some things that need to be fixed in this country. But let's, as we come into this Thanksgiving week, remind ourselves that we are living better than people throughout most of history. Our educational achievements, our medical achievements, the level of prosperity. Yes, we can complain about what we don't have, but when you start comparing where we are in 2025 to where people were a century ago, a millennium ago, we were doing so well. And so did want to talk about the fact that we do live in some ways a golden age, though there's certainly more to do. But Alan West says, let's look at these 6 individuals. We're talking about 2 senators. That would be Elisa Slotkin of Michigan and Mark Kelly of Arizona. And then we have 4 representatives, Jason Crow of Colorado, Chris DeLuzio of Pennsylvania, Maggie Goodlander of New Hampshire, and Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania. Now, the argument is very simple. You probably have seen the video. If you haven't, just type in refuse illegal orders on any kind of YouTube and you'll see it, in which they are making the statement to the members of the U.S. Armed Forces, you can refuse illegal orders, you must refuse illegal orders. Now, there are 2 ways to react to it. One is to talk about what they have said, but the mainstream media chose instead to focus on reaction from Donald Trump. This would be a good place where somebody needs to come to Mr. President and say, if you could have just held back from making any statement about this, then you wouldn't have been the story. They would have been the story. But of course, he lashed out in social media and calls this seditious behavior, which may actually be technically true, and then reminds us that we actually punish people for that. But he became the story when the real story was them, because you can really think about the sort of interesting reaction to this from the legacy media. Just imagine if, let's just say, 5 years ago, you had some Republican members of Congress who had served in the military, say Senator Tom Cotton, who served in the military, for example, and is a senator from Arkansas, and some others, say you can refuse illegal orders from Joe Biden. Can you imagine the flap that would come from the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS? So now when the story is Donald Trump, wait a minute, the story is, why were they saying this in the first place? And while it is true that indeed, if you are given an illegal order, and think of Nazi Germany, we've just been talking about that, you are not to obey those for sure, even though you may pay the consequences for that. But again, Alan West, having served in the military himself, said, if anything, the actions of these members of the federal legislative branch would constitute an act of sedition and even treason. Sedition, if you're not familiar, is the conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state or monarchy. And so again, these are individuals, as elected individuals, who also served, in many cases, the military or some branch, could be the CIA as well as armed forces, that took an oath to the Constitution and also did so as members of the military. So there's a couple ways to look at that. I thought it was kind of interesting. Colonel Alan West said, where were these voices when the Biden-Harris regime was ordering healthy American troops to take an unproven shot or else be terminated from service to the nation? One of those questions he's asking, and then goes into a paragraph explaining it, where he says, were these voices of these sex individuals when the Biden-Harris administration violated the Constitution and allowed millions of illegal immigrants into the country? He reminds us that Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution clearly states the federal government is to guarantee to every state protection from invasion. Goes into some of that as well and talks about those who were killed and those who were poisoned by fentanyl. He asked another question, where were the voices of these members of their particular political party when the Biden-Harris administration enacted the greatest military debacle in our history, that is the withdrawal from Afghanistan? Perhaps those troops should have refused the insidious, incompetent, illegal order to conduct that withdrawal, and nothing was said by these chuckleheads when over $8 billion of U.S. military equipment was left behind for the Taliban. Why not refuse that illegal and unethical order as well? And he says these 6 members said nothing while our military was decimated, recruitment dropped, and readiness plummeted. And as I've said before, you will earn a right to speak to these issues if, when the issues were on the other foot, you spoke to them as well. You will notice, if you look at some of my commentaries, that both of these commentaries, yesterday and today's, has a picture of Bill Maher. Not because we agree with him theologically or even agree with him politically, but here's a man who is willing to call out his own tribe when they are doing things and saying things they should not be doing or saying. And this, I think, is kind of the issue at hand. And this is why, again, Colonel Alan West raises this issue. It is time that these elected officials who are inciting violence against federal law enforcement officers, he says, be held accountable and charged with some of these actions. And so again, if indeed you are convinced that some of these things, like deportation, are illegal, then you need to come out and say that. But of course, as I think is illustrated in this particular piece, when asked about this, it really didn't go very far. Let's again just remind you that on Sunday, on This Week, ABC's This Week with Martha Raddatz, she actually had Elisa Slotkin, Senator Slotkin, on the program and said she was receiving death threats and interpreted those as a reaction to Trump's social media posts. Maybe it's because individuals that had served in the military thought that what you said and did was not appropriate, but we'll leave it where it is. Then when pressed, Senator Slotkin admitted that she could not come up with any illegal order that Donald Trump had issued, but still maintained that the warning was justified. What I like is Senator Lindsey Graham said, you owe it to the men and women of the military to be specific about what you're talking about. What these senators and House members did was unnerving. It was unconscionable to suggest the President of the United States is issuing unlawful orders without giving an example. So Jason Crow, when he was on, made the argument that, we simply need to anticipate this. He was on the Face the Nation, and again, as a former Army Ranger veteran, said he also got these threats. But he defended the video by suggesting that even if an illegal order were issued, members of the military might not be ready to defy the commander-in-chief, so that's why we need to groom them ahead of time. Not the best choice of words, but we'll leave it where it is there. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, it isn't just Republicans and conservatives raising questions, but I've got this piece here, comes from Matt Taibbi, former Rolling Stone editor, who, interestingly enough, when the Russian collusion material came out, he was one of those skeptics on the left, which caused a lot of people on the left to criticize him. And he says this time it reminds him of that. It was such a blatant, bad, overwrought propaganda. It reminds me again of the beginnings of Russiagate, when those leaks were about encouraging people not to share intelligence with the United States. That made Trump look bad, but it also made the United States look weak and vulnerable, sent a signal to the world that there was a schism. And he says, what are they trying to project? Well, if nothing else, there have been a few people that have been very critical of what these 6 individuals have said. And if you want to read all of what Colonel Allen West had to say, it's on our website at pointofview.net. I'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In the few minutes we have left today, I just thought we might once again remind ourselves that we're coming to Thanksgiving, and it's a time when we should be thankful. And this piece by John Stossel, which you can read or you can also watch the video, is just a reminder of how, in many cases, though we talk about so many problems, we are blessed to be living in this country at this time in history. He points out that we media types obsess about America's problems, but we should acknowledge that today, life in America is better than life has been anywhere ever. For most of history, he points out, the norm was hunger, disease, illiteracy, slavery, and war. There are a few exceptions. The so-called golden ages of the ancient Athens, maybe the Roman Empire, the Renaissance. But he talks about a video that he does with historian Johan Norberg. Now, that name might be familiar to those of you that have been receiving my booklet on socialism, because my booklet on a biblical view on socialism is where I quote a number of individuals, but one of those is Johan Norberg. The reason I quote him is because the people promoting socialism right now are individuals that say, well, when you want to understand what socialism is, don't look at North Korea, don't look at China, don't look at the Soviet Union, don't look at Venezuela, don't look at Cuba, look at Sweden. And one of the things that's so helpful is there are people that have been working in those areas to say, we're not socialist. I quote, first of all, Anders Hagström about the whole issue of looking at the Nordic countries and all the rest. But then I also quote from Johan Norberg, who makes it clear that, quote, Sweden is not socialist because the government doesn't own the means of production. To see that, you have to go to Venezuela or Cuba or North Korea. Now, he does admit in my little booklet here that sometimes they had something that resembled Sweden in socialism. So you had kind of a flirting with Swedish socialism, but it was such a disaster that people were so heavily taxed that as a result, they simply abandoned that. And the example I love to use is from the author of Pippi Longstocking. If you're familiar with the book Pippi Longstocking, Astrid Lindgren actually had a situation because of the really onerous income tax requirements that she actually paid 102% on every book that was sold when you added up both the national and then the Providence taxes as well. And so if nothing else, I've used him before in our booklet on socialism. And if you would like to copy, of course, you can get that. But let's go back to the video because historian Johan Norberg has written a new book, which I haven't purchased, but I think I'm going to have to go out and buy as well, called Peak Human. And it really looks at the miracle of the Roman Empire, which at one point extended through most of Europe and parts of Africa and Asia. And he said, if you think about it, we are still receiving some of the benefits and the historical impact of Rome. He said, for example, there's a reason why we have a Senate and why they meet in a capital. Those ideas obviously were borrowed from the Romans. And then, of course, John Stossel says, well, yeah, but they were conquering people and they were individuals that were subjugating individuals. And Norberg points out, yes, they conquered, but some became emperors. And John Stossel says, emperors? And he said, yes, the son of a freed slave eventually ended up on the throne of Rome. That tells you something about the power of meritocracy and of openness. You get the best brains if you're open to more people. And the point he's making is they benefited a lot from trade, which is maybe a slight against Donald Trump right now. But he says tolerance was a weapon. They oftentimes used it. They got their swords from the Spaniards, ships from Carthage, new business models from other groups. Because Rome was such a huge integrated free trade area, you could source the best material, the best technology for any part of the empire. Therefore, they became what? The masters of the world. Well, why did Rome collapse? Very easy. Bread and circuses. The emperors wanted to become popular by handing out free stuff to people. Originally, this started small. You just handed the very poor the means of subsistence, but it became popular, so the group that lived on the public's expense grew larger all the time. John Stossel interjects, it reminds me of the unsustainable promises we see today. Social Security and Medicare, the absurd retirement promises in other countries, welfare plans of going broke. And Norberg says once you have an ever-expanding system of entitlements that you can't afford, that's often the beginning of the decline and fall. Rome could have conquered the world, but they couldn't do entitlement reform. Actually, since they used coins, not paper money, they devalued their currency by putting less gold and silver in each coin. Inflation was so much worse than the barbarian invaders, he says. The emperor blamed greedy businessmen, something we hear today. He imposed a price control on 1,000 goods, but obviously it failed. Prices kept rising and undermined the Roman Empire completely. Today, as he points out, America is one of the richest and most innovative countries in the world, but he asks the question, will our golden age continue? And he says, that is Norberg, one of the most worrying signs in history is you begin to take wealth and comfort for granted. You forget what it made to make it possible to begin with. I see a lot of worrying signs now. We have a backlash against things that keep our society innovative, like trade, migration, unsustainable debts. But that doesn't mean we're doomed. It's not automatic. This decline and fall phase, you can unleash new waves of innovation and progress. We still have time. We can save this golden age. So again, it's a reminder that indeed we are seeing an economy which is not going well. And I point you again to my commentary yesterday, which was entitled Bill Maher and the Economy, or even some of the previous ones we've talked about in terms of shutdown economics and the rest, in which I've really tried to help us understand that we have some economic problems, but we first have to acknowledge they are problems, and then we have to figure out how to begin to solve them. So again, during this Thanksgiving time, let's once again remind ourselves that we have life better than most people that have ever lived on this planet have. But at the same time, we have some challenges if we want to have a true golden age that Donald Trump says he wants us to have. We've got to change some very significant things in our society, maybe even change some of our expectations and become once again a grateful people. Just before we go, let me mention that this time next week we will have Giving Tuesday. And if you're grateful for some of the things that we provide to you here on Point of View, we would certainly appreciate your financial gift. And if you can give next Tuesday, or certainly by the end of the year, we would greatly appreciate it. If you go to the website, you will see all sorts of articles we've posted here today that I think will help you understand a little bit more about the two books we talked about with Wendy Patrick and William Federer, but also some of these articles that help you understand more about what we are trying to do here on Point of View. If you'd like to listen to it again, click on that button that says Watch or Listen. And of course, we also encourage you to check out the podcast, including the Point of View highlights on Spotify. All available at the website, pointofview.net. Once again, want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you back here tomorrow for our Wednesday's Point of View, right here on Point of View.
I have a little nutcracker decoration that counts down the days, and it tells me that Thanksgiving and Christmas are coming fast. But you know, so is another special day, Giving Tuesday. December 2nd, people around the world are going to take part in this annual tradition of showing generosity in the middle of a season that's often marked by busyness and consumerism. It is so easy to focus on what we need in our own life, but I encourage you, pray about what you can give this Giving Tuesday and consider partnering with Point of View. By partnering with Point of View this Giving Tuesday, you'll be part of a mission to give truth to America in a time when it's desperately needed. Mark your calendar so you don't forget to give on Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. Or you can give anytime by visiting us online at pointofview.net or calling 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.